Okay, it's fun for Arthur and Bev Herzog in terms of the 23rd yahrzeit of Arthur's grandmother, Rachel Friedlander, who departed this world on the 16th of Tevet. Today is her yahrzeit, January 14th, 1998, in her 102nd year. May her memory continue to be a source of comfort, and may her neshama forever be bound to the entire family. And I want to thank the Herzog family for that. And Vakasha.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to the sponsors as well. Kanai Nohara, 102 years. Okay, I've entitled this shiur "Settling Old Scores," and we will be focusing on one particular part of King David's last will and testament. The connection between this week's Haftarah and the Sidra consists primarily of the four underlined words that appear at the very beginning of the Haftarah. Vayikrevu Yemei David Lamot, that David was drawing near to his death, and that parallels exactly a phrase in this week's Sidra, Vayikrevu Yemei Yisrael Lamot, that Jacob too was drawing near to the end of his life. A big difference, of course, between Jacob, who died at the age of 147, and King David, who died at the age of 70. But it's because of this similarity in language that this was chosen to be the Haftarah, although there are some other similarities between them. Jacob, in his last, I don't know, not particularly clear whether all that he had to say about his children took place on one day at one time. Perhaps he didn't have the strength to do it all at once. Perhaps it was an extended conversation. But in any event, he essentially leaves his children with some thoughts, some reflections on their personalities, their characters, their pasts, and their futures. It's more or less the consensus of rabbinic literature to refer to it as Jacob's blessings, Birchot Yaakov, although it's abundantly clear that not every one of his children received a blessing. Some of them received not a bracha, but in the old Yiddish joke, they received 3/4 of a bracha. And if you don't know what 3/4 of a bracha is, 3/4 of a bracha is a brach. Okay. For example, he's critical of his firstborn son, Reuven. He's critical of his second-born son, Shimon. He's critical of his third-born son, Levi. And he's a little less critical of his other sons, but there are some innuendos there nevertheless. In a Dvar Torah that my wife wrote this week for the Lincoln Square Synagogue bulletin, she points out that constructive criticism, when offered in a loving manner, is in fact a blessing within itself. So perhaps in respect of that, we can consider Reuven, Shimon, and Levi as having been blessed as well. King David doesn't so much bless his son Shlomo as much as he actually gives Shlomo instructions, some general instructions on how to conduct himself as a king, and some particular instructions that relate to how Shlomo is to deal with some of the leftover business that David himself was unable to finish in his own lifetime. So as King David lies dying, as we see, he instructs his son Shlomo to settle some old scores that are outstanding. Two in particular, one with Yolav ben Tzeruiah, who was not only the commander-in-chief of David's army, but according to rabbinic tradition, with some foundation in the book of Chronicles, David's own nephew. and the other with Shimi ben Gera. We'll be reacquainted with them as we go along. What happens is that Yoav ben Tzeruiah throws his support behind another of David's sons, Adoniyahu ben Chagit, who, even while his father was still alive and before his father had made any notice of who was to be his successor, had already begun to spread the word that he was going to succeed his father. And Yoav ben Tzeruiah, through his support, and I suppose today we would say the support of the military-industrial complex behind Adoniyahu. And however, when it turns out that Adoniyahu is not going to secure the throne, but that the throne would be occupied by Shlomo, by Solomon, Yoav kind of realizes that his life was forfeit. He was essentially a mored b'malchut. He was essentially acting in a treacherous fashion. And he sought sanctuary in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. He was taken from there, brought before King Solomon, and charged with the murders of Avner ben Ner, who again will be reacquainted with them, who had been the general of the armies of King Saul, and therefore a rival of David and Yoav, and also with the murder of Amasa ben Yeter, another military official who had served King David. According to a reasonably straightforward reading, according to the Parshat of the Book of Kings, Yoav was immediately and unceremoniously executed by King Solomon's right-hand man, Benayahu ben Yehoyada. As we will see, however, the Talmudic Agadah actually has Yoav brought to trial. And not only is he brought to trial before King Solomon, but he successfully defends himself against both of the murder charges and ends up being executed on a third charge, his collaboration in the unsuccessful coup of Adoniyahu. And essentially what we're going to do is examine Yoav's defense against those murder charges, in which the predominant element is the question of what obedience do soldiers owe to the orders that are issued to them by their superiors. I will admit in all candor and gratitude that the inspiration for this presentation, for the discussion of the rabbinic view on defying illegal orders, comes from an essay that was published many years ago by the late Professor Moshe Greenberg, a renowned scholar of Tanakh, Parshanot, and the ancient Near East, entitled Rabbinic Reflections on Defying Illegal Orders. I added sources here and there, and of course the adaptation of the sources is entirely original, and therefore I, and not the late Professor Greenberg, bear responsibility for the conclusions that will be drawn here. So here we go. It's a very brief Haftarah, barely a dozen psukim. And here we see the opening where David gives Solomon some general advice on how to comport himself as a king. And you see it underlined here, V'shamarta et mishmeret Hashem Elohecha, that you should keep the charges or the statutes of the Lord, Lalechet bidbrachav, to follow in the ways that he has dictated, Lishmor chukotav mitzvotav u'mishpatav v'edvotav, in order and to keep all of the statutes, the laws, etc., kakatuv b'Torah Moshe, as they are written in the Torah. For what advantage? Leman taskil et kol asher ta'aseh ve'et kol asher tifneh sham, so that you'll be successful wherever you turn. And furthermore, leman yakim Hashem et divaro, so that God will indeed keep the word, his promise, asher diber alai lemor, that he had given to David himself, saying, Im yishmuru vanecha darkam lalechet lefanai be'emet, that if your descendants will continue to follow in my ways, be'emet, faithfully, b'chol avavam u'b'chol nafsham, a recurring phrase throughout Tanakh, with all of their hearts and with all of their souls, then God made a promise saying, Lo yikaret lecha ish me'al kisei Yisrael, that the Davidic dynasty will be uninterrupted. So these are the general instructions that David gives to Solomon. And we move now to the specific instructions. And they read as follows. V'gam ata yada'ata et asher asa li Yoav ben Tzruya. You surely know, David says to Solomon, what Yoav ben Tzruya did to me. What did he do to me? It's actually what he did l'shnei sarei tzivot Yisrael. It's something that Yoav, who was himself a sar tzava, right, a general of the armies, did in his relationships with two other generals of the army. One is Avner ben Ner, and the other is Amasa ben Yeter. What did he do to them? Vayahargem. He slew them. Now, wait a second. Avner ben Ner was the general of the army of King Saul, and King Saul was pursuing David, was a rival to David. That made Avner ben Ner and Yoav ben Tzruya the generals of opposing armies. When opposing armies oppose each other, right, it's not unlikely that somebody's going to get killed. So we'll see that there was somewhat more to it than just the fact that Avner was killed in a battle against Yoav. Amasa ben Yeter is a little more perplexing because he was one of David's own officers, one of Yoav's own officers. But again, as I said, we're going to see the details. Vayasem demei milchama b'shalom. That the accusation against Yoav ben Tzruya is that he shed blood, not in wartime, but in peacetime. Vayitain demei milchama is as though he smeared, as it were, the blood of battle, b'chagorato asher b'motnav, on his equipment belt, uvna'alo asher b'raglav, and on his shoes. Meaning that the insinuation, the implication, or maybe it's an explication, is that these were not killings, these were actually murders. Vasita kechochmatecha, David says to Solomon, you act according to your wisdom. V'lo tored sevato b'shalom sha'ol. Don't allow Yoav ben Tzruya to go to the grave in peace. Okay. So, as I told you, according to the continuation of the story in Sefer Melachim, Solomon has Yoav brought to him, and he instructs his right-hand man, Benayahu ben Yehoyada, to kill Yoav, to execute him, and he's executed on the spot. The Talmud, the Agadah, never at a loss for embellishment, tells us that in that interval, an interval that's not even noticeable in the biblical text, the interval between the moment that Yoav is brought into the presence of King Solomon and the time that Benayahu ben Yehoyada actually executes him, in that interval, a trial was conducted. And here we have the passage in its entirety. Okay. You see it here. It comes from the Talmud Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Mem Tet Amud Aleph, and it reads as follows. King Solomon brought Yoav to trial and said to him, why did you kill Avner? Yoav replied, I was avenging my brother Asael. Now we add parenthetically, right, that the Torah recognizes a concept called Goel Hadam, an avenger. And it tells us that if somebody is murdered, then it is within the rights of the kin, the nearest kin of the victim, to avenge his death by executing the murderer. Okay? So Yoav is making the claim that Avner murdered Yoav's brother Asael, and therefore Yoav was able to assume the persona of a Goel Hadam, of an avenger, and therefore his killing of Avner was an act of revenge, a permissible act of revenge. We have to go for the moment to the details. So just give me a moment because I prepared the supplementary texts And here we go. Here's the first supplementary text, okay? There's a battle taking place between the forces of King David and the forces of King Saul. And we're told at the outset that all three of the sons of Tzruya were engaged in the battle. There was Yolav, who we know was probably the eldest and certainly the highest ranking of the three, and two of his brothers, one named Avishai, who was also a general staff officer, and a third brother, apparently the youngest, named Asael. And we're told that Asael, Kal braglav ke'achad hatzvayim asher basadeh, that Asael was as swift as a deer. Now you got to know that when the Torah tells us something about somebody's physical comportment, tells us the color of his eyes, or tells us something about his height, or tells us something about his agility, there's something coming, right? The Torah generally is rather sparse, parsimonious in terms of providing physical details about people. So when the Torah seems to provide some superfluous information about somebody's physical comportment, we kind of know already that it's germane to the story. So what happens is that the forces of King Saul are routed by the forces of King David. They flee, okay? Avner, the general, right, flees as well. And Asael, the younger brother of Yoav, pursued Avner, okay? And he pursues him, and he will not be diverted in his pursuit, okay? Moving on to verse 20, Avner, right, is apparently pretty light on his feet also, right, if he can stay ahead of Asael. And while he's running, while he's escaping, he turns back and he says, "Is that you, Asael, pursuing me?" And the reply is, "Yes, it's me." And in verse 21, Avner continues to hold a conversation with his pursuer. And he says to Asael, "Netelecha, turn away, turn to the right, turn to the left, go after someone else," right? And Asael refuses to be diverted. And in verse 22, Avner persists. And once again, he says to Asael, "Turn away, stop your pursuit of me, because I'm going to have to kill you. And if I kill you, I'll never, ever be able to look your brother Yoav in the face again." But in verse 23, Vayima'en lasur, once again, Asael refuses to be diverted. And what happens? Vayakehu Avner ba'acharei hachanit. Avner is so adept, is so skilled, that he can swing his spear backwards and strikes Asael with the back of his spear el hachomesh. Not 100% clear what chomesh means. You see the English translation here translates it as in the groin. Certainly a much more frequent translation or interpretation of hachomesh is the fifth rib, because the fifth rib, if you count the ribs, right, not vertebrae per se, but the ribs, the fifth rib is positioned over the heart. So essentially, if that indeed is what is intended, it means that Avner was so skilled that not only was he be able to deliver a mortal blow backwards, but he was able to deliver it in the place in which his pursuer was the most vulnerable. Okay? And furthermore, vatetze hachanit me'acharav, with such force that the spear actually pierced his body and came out the dorsal side of through his back, okay? Vayipol sham vayamot tachtav, and Asael dies on the spot. Okay, so this is the incident that is alluded to. I'm going to move back now to the previous text that we were looking at. Just give me 1 second and we will get there. Okay. This is the story that is being alluded to in David's instructions to Solomon. And this is what Yolav is referring to in his trial. So let's go back again and reread the first paragraph. And now, in light of having reread the story, we'll be able to do better with it. King Solomon brought Yolav to trial and said to him, "Why did you kill Avner?" Yolav replied, "I was avenging my brother Asael." Question: wasn't Asael in pursuit of Avner? Meaning Avner was only defending himself, in which case he didn't murder Asael. It was self-defense. And if it was self-defense, then you have no right to act as an avenger. Yoav says, well, Avner could have saved himself by wounding Asael in one of his limbs. He needn't have killed him. Question again, perhaps he was not able to do so. Answer, well, if he was able to strike him at the 5th rib, then surely he was, adept enough, skilled enough, that if he had wanted to, he could have just wounded him, could have stabbed him in the leg. If he stabbed him in the leg, he wouldn't have been able to continue his pursuit. If he didn't stab him in the leg, but he actually slew him, he pierced his heart, then clearly this was not just self-defense. This was effectively an act of murder, and therefore Yoav claims that he's legitimately allowed to have taken Avner's life. Okay. Now we have to move to the second case. The second charge against Yoav is that he's guilty of the murder of Amasa ben Yeter. Once again, we just have to, I keep pressing the wrong button, but we'll go to we got to go now to the next text. Here's the story of Amasa ben Yeter, okay? As you can see, the previous story took place in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel. This story takes place in chapter 20 of 2 Samuel, so it's considerably later. It's towards the end of David's life. David instructs Amasa as follows. He tells him, Haze'ekli et ish Yehuda shloshet yamim. I want you to gather the men of Judah together in 3 days. So, next verse, Vayelach Amasa lahazik et Yehuda. So Amasa follows the king's orders. He goes to gather together the men of Judah. However, Vayocher min hamoed asher ya'ado. But instead of returning with them in 3 days as he was instructed, he delayed, he tarried longer than the 3 days that were stipulated. Okay? All right. The following details are not germane to our discussion, but we find that when he returns, when Amasa returns, Yoav meets him, okay? And Yoav, here you can see in verse 9, Yoav says to Amasa, Hashalom ata achi, is everything okay with you, brother? Vatoches yad yamin Yoav, and Yoav with his right hand takes hold of Zakan Amasa, of Amasa's beard, Sokolow, as though he were going to kiss him. Va'amasa lo nishmar, but Amasa thought that Yoav was being friendly, and therefore he wasn't on his guard. B'cherev asher biyad Yoav, he didn't notice that Yoav had an unsheathed sword in his hand. Vayakehu ba el hachomesh, and Yoav strikes Amasa with the sword once again in the 5th rib. Vayishpoch me'av arza, and he basically cuts open his stomach or his intestines. So he kills him. Okay. And here there's no discussion at all of what is it that Amasa did that provoked Yoav. Okay. So we go back now to the other text. And we read the continuation. So Solomon says to Yoav, okay, let's leave the subject of Abner aside. Yoav apparently made a good argument in defense of his slaying of Avner. He says, why did you kill Amasa? And Yoav replied, because Amasa committed treason against King David. And here he reads the verses that he cites the verses that we just looked at. The king ordered Amasa to summon all the men of Judah in 3 days' time. Amasa went to summon them, but he tarried. If he tarried, then he wasn't fulfilling the king's orders. If he wasn't fulfilling the king's orders, he was a mored b'malchut. He was effectively acting as a traitor in a treasonous fashion. And the law is that somebody who acts as a traitor to the king should be executed. Solomon said, wait a second. Amasa tarried for a perfectly good reason. What is the good reason? He tarried because he construed buts and onlys. Darash achim verakim. What does that mean? We go again to the other text. This is an allusion to a text at the very beginning of the first chapter of the book of Joshua. I hope you can see that there is, I make it a little smaller so you can get it all in, that you can see that there is a recurring phrase here. I've underlined it several times. Within a relatively short chapter, okay, going from verse 6 through 18, in a dozen verses, we have the phrase chazak ve'ematz repeated no fewer than 4 times. Anytime you get a single word or a pair of words appearing with such frequency in a reasonably short amount of text, it's considered to be a leading word or a leading phrase. It's pointing to something. And here it's pointing to something very significant, very considerable. The very first time it appears in verse 6, it's God. God is speaking. He says to Joshua, Kasher hayiti im Moshe eheye imach, that I will be with you just as I was with your master Moses, on condition that you, Joshua, chazak ve'ematz. You have to be strong and fortified, okay? Strong and fortified, right? Because you're the one who's going to distribute the land of Israel to the people as I have promised them. And then he repeats himself again in verse 7, saying again, rak, here's your rak, right? Only. Chazak ve'ematz ma'od. Okay? Not only must you be strong and resolute, right? You must be exceptionally strong and resolute. To do what? Lishmor la'asot kechol haTorah asher tzivcha Moshe avdi. Chazak ve'ematz doesn't mean to go to the exercise room and to work out with weights. Chazak ve'ematz means to study the law, to be sure that at all times and under all conditions and circumstances, you will abide by it and follow it. And God basically says to Yehoshua, again in verse 9, halot tziviticha chazak ve'ematz, that if indeed you are strong and resolute in following the Torah, al ta'arotz va'al techat, you will have nothing to fear, ki imacha Hashem Elohecha b'chol asher telech, because you can trust that God will be with you. And this message is not lost on the people. 4 lines from the bottom of the text in verse 16, the people speak, and the people say to Joshua, Kol asher tzivitanu na'aseh, whatever you command us to do, we will obey. El kol asher tishlachenu nelech, we will carry out any mission that you give us. Kol asher shamanu el Moshe ken nishma elecha, we will give you the same obedience that we gave to Moses. Right? Should add parenthetically, right? That's a left-handed compliment, right? Because, Moses got into trouble because the people didn't always obey his instructions, okay? Nevertheless, they say, however, rak, right? However, only, meaning they impose as it were a condition. And what is their obedience to Joshua conditional on? Rak yihiyeh Hashem Elohecha imach kasher haya im Moshe. Our obedience is not to you as a human being, as an individual. Our obedience to you is as God's representative. Kol ish asher yamre et picha, anyone who disobeys you, v'lo yishma divarecha l'cho asher titzavenu, and who disobeys any of your orders, yumat, right, will be guilty of a capital crime and should be executed. And then they repeat the same condition that God imposed. Rak chazak ve'ematz, providing, right, that your orders, that your instructions are in conformity with Torah law. Therefore, obedience to a king stops, if you will, at the entrance to the Beit Midrash. Okay? A king's orders cannot overrule or override the Torah. Okay, so now we have to come back to our initial text, to the text of the Talmudic trial of Yolav. Solomon said to Avner, why did you kill Amasa? Yoav replied, because Amasa committed treason against the king because he didn't bring the men of Judah within the 3 days as he had been instructed. Solomon said, Amasa was justified in delaying. Why? Because he found them, the people of Judah, engaged in Torah study. And he reasoned as follows. The Israelites promised Joshua, as we just read, anyone who contradicts you or disobeys you, whatever you command shall die. Does that include disagreement on account of Torah study? No, because the verse continues, only be firm and resolute. Rak chazak ve'ematz. Meaning, Amasa was justified in tarrying because Torah study supersedes, it transcends the king's instructions. So why indeed was Yoav executed? He was executed because, as we said at the outset, he had sided with Adoniyahu and not with Solomon. Okay. Now the curious thing is that this is not the first place where Avner and Amasa meet. They don't meet ever really in the Tanakh, but this isn't the only place in Talmudic literature where they meet. They met previously in Talmudic literature, and for that we have to go to yet another biblical text. I can make this a little bigger again. And here we go back to the first book of Samuel, chapter 22. David is in flight from King Saul, and he stops a little north of Jerusalem in a town called Nov that was populated primarily by Kohanim because it had ready access to the Mishkan. And Achimelech, who was the Kohen Gadol, provides David and his men with provisions and provides David with the sword of Goliath. Word of this comes to King Saul, who is enraged because Clearly, Achimelech is guilty of aiding and abetting a criminal. Okay. So in verse 17, Vayomer HaMelech laratzim hanitzavim alav, the king turns to the guards who were with him, and he gives them the instruction, Sobu, turn about, v'hamitu kohanei Hashem, and execute, slay the Kohanim. Tell a Jewish soldier to kill a Kohen? Lo avu avdei HaMelech lishloach et yadam lifgoa b'kohanei Hashem. The king's officers, the guards, refuse to obey his instruction. So he turns to Doeg, who is identified as an Edomite, an Edomi, and he says to Doeg, you kill them. And Doeg apparently has no such scruples. So Vayisov Doeg ha'Edomi vayifgahu ba'kohanim, he turns about and he falls upon the Kohanim, and he kills 85 ish, 85 Kohanim on that day. And then Saul and his forces set about destroying the balance of the city of Nov. Okay, back to the Talmud. Here the selection is actually from the Talmud Yerushalmi rather than the Talmud Bavli. And it asks an interesting question. Who were the servants who refused Saul's order to slay the Kohanim of Nov? And Rabbi Shmuel ben Yitzchak said, they were Avner and Amasa. And indeed, they said to King Saul, we refuse to obey your order. If we owe you anything besides our belts and coats, meaning their uniforms, take them back, meaning, we quit. Okay. Curiously, the Talmud Bavli had certain reservations about their conduct. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, why did Avner meet an untimely death? Because he failed to take a stand against Saul. Now, wait a second. What do you mean he failed to take a stand? If the Talmud Yerushalmi is correct, and he is one of the officers who was told to kill the Kohanim, and he refused, then he did take a stand against Saul. No, but the question is, and it's a fascinating one, is it sufficient to refuse to obey an illegal order, or must you do something besides passive refusal to obey? And this following text I put in italics because it's my own, it's not the Talmud's. Avner's death at the hands of Yolav was Avner's just deserts for his failure to assume a more vigorous opposition to the murder of the Kohanim of Nov. And this provides us with another important insight into the laws of obeying orders. It may not be enough to abstain passively from obeying an illegal order. You might have to offer more than your resignation. And indeed, there's a passage in the Talmud in Masechet Shabbat elaborating on a verse in the book of Ezekiel where God tells Ezekiel to go through the streets of Jerusalem and to place a mark on the foreheads of all of the people who sigh and groan over the abominations committed in her, and they are going to be spared while everybody else is going to be slain. The Talmud makes the point that it's not enough to refrain from committing evil. Sometimes one has to take an active stand against it. Okay. But we move on now in the Talmud to what I call Exhibit 3, Yoav and disobedience, a contrast. The Talmud continues and says, God brought Yoav's guilt down upon his own head for having struck down two more righteous and better men than he. Better in that they, that is Avner and Amasa, construed the buts and onlys, meaning they knew where to draw the line between obeying orders and obeying the Torah, while Yoav did not. But they were also more righteous than Yoav, in that they refused a command that Saul gave them that came only from him orally, while Yoav obeyed a command that came in writing. I want to make sure that the point is well taken, right? If a soldier is given a command, a verbal command, there's room for negotiation, right? There's room for argument. I didn't hear it, right? I don't think that's exactly what he said. I don't think that was his tone of voice, okay? However, when you get an order in writing and it says, signed by the commanding officer, this is what you're supposed to do, okay? Then you either do it or not. There's no middle ground, okay? So Amasa and Avner, when Saul told them to kill the priests of Nob, they could have, they said, oh, an oral argument. This is not exactly what he said. And yet, even though it was only an oral order, only a verbal order, they still refused to obey it. Yoav, on the other hand, received an illegal order from King David in writing, and he didn't disregard it because it was clearly a legal order, right? And he didn't disregard it, and therefore he's not as righteous. Question is, what is the illegal order that King David gave to Yoav in writing? And for this, we need to move to the final passage, the final biblical passage that we have to look at this evening. And this is as follows, very famous from the 12th chapter of the second book of Samuel. It follows immediately upon the parable that the prophet Natan laid out before King David, the one about the rich man who has a sheep, right? And King David condemns the rich man, and the prophet says to King David, Atah ha'ish, right? This is only a parable, and you are the man. That is to say, you are guilty of stealing another man's wife. This follows after the incident in which David contrived, together with Yoav, to have Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, killed in battle, so that David would be able to marry her. So the illegal order is the order that David sent to Yoav in the field of battle, instructing him to place Uriah in a particularly dangerous situation, and then withdraw all assistance from him, so that he would, as it turned out, be overwhelmed by the enemy and slain. And here the prophet Natan is condemning King David for this. And you can see the underlined passage in verse 9, okay? The prophet says to King David, Et Uriah hachiti hikita v'cherev, you smote him with the sword. Et ishto lakachta lecha leisha, you took his wife to be your own. And then it says somewhat redundantly, Va'oto haragta b'cherev b'nei Ammon. You had him slain by the enemy, by the Ammonites. Well, you already said you slew him. What is, why does it repeat himself? Why does he say you slew him and you also killed him with the sword? Okay. We go back now to the conclusion of the Talmudic passage, of the Talmudic presentation of the trial. The Talmud elsewhere in Masechet Kiddushim says as follows. It says, Ein shaliach lidvar aveira. If you appoint an agent and you instruct the agent to commit a crime, then the question is, who's responsible for the commission of the crime? The principal who commissioned it, or the agent who committed it? Now, you might think that the principal is guilty because it was his idea. The Talmud says no. Talmud says, Ein shaliach lidvar avera. You cannot, agency, meaning the fact that you are not acting on your own behalf, on your own recognizance, but rather you are acting as somebody else's agent, cannot be used to excuse the commission of a crime. Therefore, if one commissions an agent to commit murder and he complies, the agent is guilty and the principal is exempt. Shammai the elder said in the name of the prophet Haggai, no, the agent is guilty because he had choice. He has free will. He could have said, this is an illegal order. I'm not going to follow it. But that we cannot excuse the principal entirely. The principal is also guilty. How do I know? From the story of David and Uriah. Because if the prophet Nathan says to David, you slew him, then obviously David bore responsibility for his death, along with Yolav, who was the one who actually sent him into battle and withdrew the support from him. So according to the Talmud, what seemed initially to be a redundancy turns out to be not redundant, but it turns to be didactic, because it teaches us that in this case, at least according to Shammai, that not only is Yoav, the agent, guilty of the death of Uriah, but so is David, as the principal, bears the same responsibility. But the interesting thing here is an insight provided in a commentary there in 2 Samuel 12 by Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, the 13th century, who writes as follows. Our sages have said, although the universal rule is there is no agency for the commission of a crime, ein shaliach lidvar avera, and everywheres the agent is guilty and not the principal, here, says Radak, the situation is different, because obviously the verse, the prophet in the verse, called David a killer. And why is this, says Radak? Because he was the king and his word was law. It was as though he did the killing himself. Similarly, when Saul ordered the killing of the Kohanim of Nov, it was as though he had killed them himself. Generally, Radak explains, a person should refrain from following illegal orders, okay? And we've explained, he says, apropos of in the beginning of the book of Joshua, right? Anyone who defies your word shall die, that this does not include the commission of a crime, because the verse says, Rak chazak ve'ematz, that you should never follow an order that is in conflict with Torah law. However, says Radak, there may be one exception to that rule. And the one exception to that rule is the king, meaning an ordinary soldier in the field, and particularly in the heat of battle, given an order by a superior officer, is not expected to call time out in the middle of the fray and to, I don't know if you can see me, if you're looking, right? I don't know if you know what I'm doing here, right? This is the international symbol for pilpul, right? Soldiers in the heat of battle, given an order that has to be fulfilled, right? Has to be carried out immediately, are not expected to call time out in the midst of battle in order to clara chakira, as they say in the Beit Midrash, in order to figure out whether the order that they're being given is a legal order, a gray order, or an illegal order. Soldiers are expected to follow their orders. Why? Because if they receive an order from a superior officer, particularly if they receive an order from the most superior officer, that is to say, the king, are entitled to presume that all of the clarifications have already been done and that the order as it was given to them is legal and therefore they bear no culpability for its execution. They were doing their jobs. It's the superior officer who issued the illegal order who bears the burden of responsibility for it. So basically, this is what the Haftarah ends there, and that is what we learn from it. Unfortunately, as we all know, from incidents not only in recent history, whether we go back 2 generations to things that happened during the Second World War, whether we go back 1 generation to things that happened in Vietnam, whether we go back, unfortunately, to incidents that occur sporadically in Israel, the question of what latitude individual soldiers have to make their own decisions about which orders they will follow and which orders they're not going to follow is unfortunately something that is a recurring moral quandary. On the other hand, it's good to see that both Chazal in the Talmud and Radak in the Middle Ages and Maimonides in Hilchot Melachim u'Milchamotehem in the Mishneh Torah, and certainly the chief rabbin of the Israel Defense Forces are sensitive to these issues and try to the greatest extent possible to give soldiers very clear guidelines in terms of just how much individual responsibility they bear or how much individual decision-making they're entitled to or not. I take a quick look at the chat. Yeah, what's the difference there between a mored b'malchut and a conscientious objector? Conscientious objector isn't per se a mored b'malchut. He's just not carrying out a civil obligation. I think there's a difference of magnitude between them. The king gave an illegal order in writing. Shouldn't his punishment? He was punished. The punishment was that, as it says in that selection from 2 Samuel 12, that the sword will never entirely be absent from David's own family. That his own descendants would die in battle. And of course, we know that the firstborn child to the marriage of David and Bathsheba did not live. So certainly David was punished. That's all I can see.
Okay, thank you very much.